Hey everybody, Adam Mason here with the Bearded Tog Podcast. Just wanted to say thank you so much for listening. We had a 2-week hiatus. I was in Iceland, and yeah, we just didn't schedule any episodes. That's real talk for you right now. We've got a few in the queue ready to go, but today we have something really special for you. Interviewing Natalie Franke, which is really cool. She founded an organization called the Rising Tide Society, in addition to being a successful photographer. So she's just got a really interesting perspective, and she just moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, and so she's got fascinating insight on transitions and leaving your job and, kind of trading one dream for the other, and we'll get into that with her. So it's super cool to have her. Thank you so much for listening. Here's Natalie Franke. Natalie, how's it going?
Oh, it's going great. How are you?
Doing well. Just dealing with some podcast blunders, if you will, but it's working out now, and we finally have you on, and really excited about it. It's gonna be awesome.
I'm so honored to be here. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this for a while. I love, love, love what you're building. I think it's absolutely incredible, and I'm not kidding. Like, I'm just honored to be a part of it. I know so many of the people that have been on this podcast, like Tiffany Farley and a few others, and it's exciting. Thank you for having me.
Hey, no worries. I appreciate it. It's just so, it's one of those things, and I think you know this too, is we'll get into the Rising Tide stuff, but just, the mindset that, I lacked something in my own education and when I was starting my own entrepreneurial, lifestyle, if you will, and there wasn't a lot out of there, and I wanted to kind of get, I wanted to have people who were experienced tell me what they thought, but I wasn't necessarily in the market for a workshop at the time. It's like your first year of business, or, but at the same time, you wanted to respect their time and, not take away from it. And so now I was like, oh, let's just make that and have it be like something people can pull up in their back pocket and be like, I know nothing about email. Tiffany Farley's really good at it. Let me, get into it, which is really funny because like I've known Tiffany for a while, but I'm on her email list, and it really, like, she gets me, like, all her subject lines and stuff like that. I'll be like, oh man, Tiffany like personally emailed me, and I'll open it and I'll be like, nope, it's from the newsletter, but I'm going to read it anyway because it was really good. And so it's just really funny. And so I love kind of having that resource, and then also just kind of being honest. I think,
Yes.
Abby Grace was on here, and Tony Hoffer, and just them giving like a really honest perspective. Like my main kind of like secret goal, we don't really like, this isn't in the headline, if you will, but it's like to demystify, what entrepreneurials and photographers do. And it's like, hey, like some people are at their computers, 40 hours a week, just editing or just emailing or,
Right.
Calling the accountant this time of year. So that's really cool. That's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me a little bit more. I know that you have recently moved out to California,
Yes.
and you're from the East Coast. So tell me a little bit more about that transition. Where were you 2 years ago, and where are you now? And then also tell us a little bit about Rising Tide.
Yeah, absolutely. So 2 years ago, I mean, ultimately, as you know, and hopefully some of you guys know, I'm a wedding photographer by trade. So I've been photographing weddings for quite a long time. Graduated from college and went straight into my business and, chased that over job opportunities. I really felt connected to photography and the industry and the idea that, I could take a camera and I could use what's in my mind and actually create it through that tool, right? Like looking at the camera as that tool that sort of enabled me to portray the world the way I saw it and capture people the way I saw them. So I loved it. So graduate from college. I am running this photography business. It's going fantastic. You guys know this. It's like you're sprinting, everything is great, and then all of a sudden, you hit a bump. And I realized very quickly that in business, it can be a very lonely place. That running a business by yourself and having no real exposure to what other photographers or entrepreneurs are doing, ultimately, it puts you in this bubble where you feel as though you're the only one going through whatever it is that you're going through. And, you mentioned like the honesty. Well, I mean, honesty hour, like running a business is hard and very rarely do things actually go the way you plan. And so when you don't have a community to support you, you don't have other photographers or other entrepreneurs just to honestly commiserate with and build one another up and support one another in those difficult moments, it is incredibly lonely. So I had experienced that loneliness for quite a while, and it wasn't until I started to share how I was feeling with other photographers, specifically two other photographers, husband and wife team. They're amazing, Krista and Davy Jones out of Annapolis, that we realized there was such a need for creatives to get together in the spirit of community over competition and communicate, connect, bond. So we started with our small town of Annapolis, Maryland, and we got a few of our friends together for coffee and we talked about business. And when our other friends in other parts of the country saw us on Instagram, they really wanted to do it too. They asked, like, how can I start a chapter? How can I do this? I think my community needs this camaraderie also. And so the Rising Tide Society was born from that moment back in May of 2015. And by June, we had 12 cities. We thought this was like insane, 12 cities, so crazy. And fast forward a couple months, we have over 100 cities at that point, and all the way to today in 2017, where we just surpassed 400 chapters now in the United States, Canada, and around the world. And the vision and the heart behind Rising Tide has been, always will be, to unite creative entrepreneurs in the spirit of community over competition, to provide free educational resources and these gatherings led by volunteers. And it's just sort of this greater vision that takes people from the online on their computer all day long, gets them off of the computer, gets them off of their devices, and has them sit down side by side with one another where we believe real relationships are formed. And so it's sort of almost countercultural in a lot of ways. That's why we say making waves. We have massive online platforms, but we're never going to care as much about the online platform as we do about getting those people offline and genuinely building relationships. And so it is a little different than I think what a lot of other communities do and have done. But for us, it really sits at the heart of trying to change what we felt was, a very lonely industry and a very isolating situation.
Definitely. No, I love that. I just from personal experience, I know with my personal chapter here in DC, led by the one and only Brittany Collier.
Yes.
She's awesome. It was just so cool. I had kind of heard it, kind of like my track record of finding things out was knew who you were, like local photographer, like doing well, had been in business for a while.
Yeah.
And I really saw you at Justin and Mary's, the event that they had in Silver Spring.
Yeah, I remember that.
That was super, super fun. And you just came out and you nerded out for a little bit. And I was like, who is this person? And so that was really cool. And I was like one of only 10 guys in that room, which was
yes, you were
such a weird thing. And but so that was really cool. And then I kind of turned into Rising Tide Society, mm-hmm. and now joined my local chapter and actually attended a meeting, and but it was so interesting just how at least our chapter is so welcoming. I came from my first meeting, didn't really know anybody. And, we're having a conversation about SEO, and a lot of the chapter meetings are educational around a topic, which I think is really cool to try and hey, let's learn this together. Not all of us are computer science majors and, know SEO stuff, which I love that we're trying to help out with that. And long story short, that day people were like, hey, Adam, I love your work, or I've been following you. And you kind of connect Instagram handles to actual people.
Yes.
And you're just like, oh yeah, okay, I've seen your name and I wasn't really sure. And that's so cool. Thank you. And, a lot of the Rising Tiders have been listening to this podcast, and it's just been insane, just that support. And, I think the goal is we all now feel a permission to be honest.
Yes.
And I think it's really cool. So thank you for that. So tell us a little bit more. So, amazing photographer, 6-figure income, doing fine, conquering the East Coast, if you will.
Yeah.
And then now, Rising Tide Society, still big. You're obviously a huge part of that. But then tell us more about what you're doing now, your new job, why'd you move?
Yes.
And then ultimately, what's it like to kind of live out one dream? For a lot of people, even in myself, I think a year ago I would have been yeah, that's my end goal, is just be a photographer forever.
Yeah.
Giving that dream up or kind of transforming that and trading that for a different focus. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes. So it's been one of the most interesting journeys, I think, of my life. As you mentioned, there's been a lot of transition, both from a professional standpoint and a personal standpoint, moving from East Coast to West. And so it all kind of originated, for those who don't know, for a little bit of background, with Rising Tide exploding and taking off at the rate that it did. We really, ultimately, the founders and I, we had to make a choice. At that point, we realized if we continued to operate the way we've been operating, we wouldn't do a great job leading a community of this size. But ultimately, as well, we were putting our businesses on the back burner, and our clients were not getting the experience that we really prided ourselves on. And so we had to make that decision. So, a couple months after Rising Tide really started to pick up steam, and I remember at the point we had like, and this is, you're going to laugh at this now, but we had like 5,000 people in the Facebook group, but ultimately we had, 175 or so chapters meeting. And now that, by the way, now the Facebook group is a monstrosity at like 50,000, fifty-five
Yeah.
thousand, something crazy. It's a little, I thought five, I was like, this is nuts. I can't, 5,000 people, this is crazy. Um, but we did, I decided ultimately to go full time. I really felt as though community building and essentially using what I had learned in photography and learned running a business for a long time to empower other people to do the same thing in the spirit of community, that really lit my heart on fire in a way I hadn't experienced prior. And so, you know, photography was one stepping stone. And I really look at it this way. It's, anything in our life, whether it's, by the way, I'm like you. If you had told me, oh, Natalie, one day you're not going to be a photographer full time, I would have thought you were crazy, especially if you had said, and you're going to live in the heart of Silicon Valley and you're going to work in tech. I would have thought you're nuts. I would have been like, I don't know what you're talking about. Um, my heart is to be a photographer, but Rising Tide exploded. And I call it like the Tinder months. Like, not that I've ever used the app. I have never used Tinder. I am happily married. However, my assistants and second shooter, specifically my beloved Maddie Short, she loved Tinder and would always joke with me about it. And it was the Tinder months of like finding sponsors to help keep Rising Tide sustainable. And it really was like swipe left, swipe right. I don't know about these companies. I would have people come to me from companies I'd never heard of. They wanted to leverage the community in ways I did not agree with. And it was just such a tumultuous time to try to continue to build into something that I knew was changing people's lives. And essentially, we flew out to San Francisco to launch a gathering out here. We met up with the folks at Honeybook. It took was one sushi lunch and us crying at a table together, like actually crying about what we felt like was missing from this world and missing from specifically the small business industry in general, to realize that there was a real partnership that could happen here. And so that's essentially what happened. We started a partnership. We eventually actually merged into one company. Rising Tide is completely supported from, every single aspect. Every free piece of knowledge and education that is shared is funded by Honeybook 100%. So every hour of my time I spend building this community is because of them. And I'm so grateful. But it freed me up to be able to run and leap wholeheartedly into something that we were building. And it was scary. I had never worked for anyone else. I've still never done a job interview in my entire life. And actually, I hope I never do. I will always be an entrepreneur. That is nothing, that's not ever changing. But I had never worked for anyone else. So that was a real adventure. However, what's funny is that a lot of the companies that provide to the creative industry are ultimately very creative themselves. So it wasn't a huge stretch of the imagination that the workplace environment here was very much similar to what I would have imagined. And I did. I essentially, in August, after giving it a lot of thought, decided to actually move out here to San Francisco to keep building the Rising Tide team. Took on the role of head of community, where essentially I lead this team and we're continuing to build systems and better resources for our community and just try to lead well. And I think that that's always a challenge with really quick growth, but also have access to advisors. Like for instance, getting to learn from people that have done this. The global head of community at Airbnb is one of our advisors, and Douglas Atkin, he's absolutely fantastic. And just to get knowledge from them about how to do a better job, how to bring creatives together, how to actually drive home our mission, our vision in everything that we do, it's been incredible, but definitely an adjustment. So trading East Coast to West, setting aside sort of this photography business that had been a piece of my heart for as long as I can remember since high school, and actually saying, you know what, I think there is something else that I could do. I think there is something that, really is directly impacting people in this moment right now, today, that, were me 2 years ago, were the girl crying on the floor, because I felt completely alone. And so when it gets hard and when I feel scared or I feel like, gosh, this is a path I don't know many other photographers have ever taken, I just remember why I'm doing it in the first place. And I really think back to that first meeting in Annapolis and how alone not only I felt, but everyone else felt. and thinking like, you know what, if I can alleviate that for one other creative, if I can help one person to have the courage to build a business that they've wanted to build forever. And if that business impacts other people, and it's a ripple effect, right? Not to use too many like wave metaphors. It,
That's hilarious.
it is though. At the end of the day, that's what it is. So yes, it's been a crazy transition. But it's one that I'm really excited to just march forward into fearlessly, because that's how all of us as entrepreneurs, that's exactly what we have to do every day. Be fearless, get out there, screw up, fall on our faces, make a mistake, fail, get back up, be fearless yet again. And that's just sort of been the last year of my life.
That is awesome. We'll get into the more serious stuff, but when you were talking about Tinder, I totally thought you were about to make like a fire analogy. You're like, yeah, it was like our Tinder phase, and we were like, just gathering up, wood before it like turned into this big roaring fire. And I was like, okay, cool. And then you went to the app, and I was like, huh, okay.
That's so funny. Yeah, no, the swipe left, swipe right. I mean, it's like, again, I don't know. In my mind, that's how I felt. It's sustainability for a community that doesn't want to monetize. Like we don't charge for gatherings, and we never will. Like, it is so important to me that the meetings are free, to the point where like that makes it nearly impossible to monetize and to be profitable as a community, unless you sell courses. And there were just so many educators already in our community that were selling their own courses and building their own platforms, that the last thing I wanted to do as well was take away from that. So we had to get creative. So sponsorships, yeah, the Tinder phase, swipe left, swipe right. I don't like this sponsor. I love this sponsor. It was a little wild.
That is hilarious. But now just is sponsorship out of the question now, and Honeybook is like, hey, this is us. Or what does that look like now?
Oh yeah, we still partner with companies all the time. Ultimately for our bigger educational events, they cost tens of thousands of dollars to put together, like the summit, for instance. And whenever we do them, we align with a charity. So our next summit, we're aligning with Pencils of Promise. The vision there is if we can get other sponsors, in addition to Honeybook, on board to actually pay for, speaker fees and the cost of the equipment. And we're going to do more of a live stream this time. It's going to be a little bit better. I'm so pumped to get those costs met. Then essentially any revenue generated can go directly to a cause we care about as well. Because again, our mission and our vision is much greater than monetizing, a community or movement. We really want to use this to bring attention to things that really matter. We last year, for instance, raised $40,000 in our last summit. 20,000 went to the U.S. Dream Academy to help break the cycle of incarceration in the United States, and then the other 20,000 went to I don't know if you've heard of Jamie Delane, but she's been working to build a school in Haiti, and I'm really, really passionate about that in particular, and just empowering, again, through education, people all around the world and within our own country, just to give children, especially, the opportunities that many of us had, many of us were lucky to have. Because I think that is something that we owe to this world, to give, especially, I don't know. It's just something I'm passionate about.
Definitely. So I want to kind of shift gears and kind of talk. Well, I guess it's not really shifting. We're just talking about Rising Tide. But so Rising Tide Society's like main mantra, is community over competition, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so I'll be honest, when I first saw that, and I think this comes from how this is actually like related to how people channel their loneliness when it comes to being an entrepreneur.
Yes.
There are some that, are kind of like, I don't know the nice way. I would just say that they kind of like slow down, if you will, or they're more of like a, they'll just wait on the other side of the river before they cross. And then there are others that are, kind of like, fine, I'll do this alone, and it might be hard and it might be challenging, but maybe they have the independence or something else kind of going through them. And so when I saw that, I had done so much kind of by myself and had my own loneliness streak, if you will, mm-hmm. And you probably felt the same. And I think in a weird way, like someday we'll talk about this and how it like kind of led to doing things better. I don't know. But, when I first saw the community over competition, I was like, oh, I like competition. Mm-hmm. And so I want to kind of dive into a little bit more about like, what does that look like, as a whole for the community in Rising Tide Society? Because people wonder, they see it and they, it's primarily photographers, but it's growing in so many other ways. But even that is just like, hey, there are 30,000 photographers in here. How do we make that work? Or how do we not, show favoritism and stuff like that? But at the same time, is there a reward or is there incentive for people who are doing well. We want to showcase those members, people who are making progress. So just tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think it's what's really important and it's so funny. You're like, I love competition. I am the first person to admit I love competition. I love it. I am a highly competitive person. It is not on my strength finder test, but it is definitely um, something that, I've always been competitive. And I think what's important to note is it's not community without competition. It's community over competition. And so we often, have people that will ask us something like, "Oh, so you don't believe in it?" And it's like, "No, absolutely. I believe in competition. I love healthy competition. It drives innovation. It pushes people forward. It encourages a lot of us who are driven in that way to strive to be the very best version of ourselves, right? When we see how other photographers are lighting a reception, we realize, oh, wow, an on-camera flash, it's just not going to cut it. I got to step up my game. I've got to improve. For that reason, I think it's fantastic. But what I found is that in a world where, we spend all of our time online and we can easily get sucked into these almost like vacuums of honestly like jealousy and comparison and fear, and we're driven by a scarcity mindset, that's where it becomes unhealthy. And so the vision here is, community first, people first, and then competition second. And that means that if someone's really struggling, if somebody desperately needs help, that we come together and we support them. If somebody, needs education and knowledge in order to run their business legitimately and correctly, we don't shun them for not being set up properly. Heck no. Like we actually will say, hey, here's how to do it right. Here's how to run a legitimate business. And yes, it's going to be harder, but this is how you have to do it. So we raise the tide simply through both uniting and educating. So I love to say that because I think people have a perception, and it's so funny when ever someone comes, to me and they're like, oh, this chick, like she thinks the world's fluffy and unicorns. And I'm like, no, actually I studied visual neuroscience and psychology and I'm a huge nerd and I can out nerd you. Like, let's do it. Like, I know this works not just from a heart perspective, but like this mentality works from a finance perspective, from a revenue perspective. Let me give you an example. As a photographer, if I didn't bond and network with other photographers, I can tell you right now, it would have taken me maybe 2 to 3 more years to hit a six-figure mark in my business. And the reason for that is simply because, you have a limited amount of events going on in a city. Yet, I want to challenge you to think of it from a perspective of abundance. And why that is because that not every photographer can take every single event or every single portrait client or every single newborn client. There is much more to go around than we realize. And so when you build these relationships, these genuine relationships with other creatives that are just like you, doing the same thing that you're doing, for me, it was other wedding photographers, then when they're not available for an event or a shoot or a wedding, they're going to send that client my way. Ultimately, when we do that for one another, when we create an ecosystem of prosperity for one another by sharing business when we can't take it on ourselves, by sharing clients when a client's not an ideal fit. Actually, that's one of the best ways to do it is when you get someone through the door. Like, for example, I'd get someone that would say, "Oh, do you shoot film? I've been admiring fine art film for so long and I love it." And I'd say, "No, my aesthetic kind of looks like film, but I'm actually a digital photographer. However, here are 5 phenomenal fine art film photographers in the Maryland and DC area that I think you should check out. And if you don't love them, feel free to come back, but I really want you to find the right fit." Why? Because if I were to take that client simply because I desperately wanted to add one more client to my calendar, that would have been a terrible experience both for me and for them. And it would have probably prolonged the amount of work that was required to make that client happy in the first place. So again, slowing down my workflow, but ultimately it wouldn't be in their best interest either. And I could have filled that weekend with a client that was the right fit. And when you start to do that, that act of reciprocity towards one another, it benefits our bottom lines. It's not just our hearts, it's our bottom lines. So I love it. I think that there's so much value in doing that and really viewing one another as sources of opportunity, sources of knowledge, and sources of friendship.
Awesome. I love that. Yeah, no, that's super cool. And also I feel like, for the most part, it's, at least in that example is, helping people find their ideal client. So, kind of works the opposite way. Obviously, like if somebody was looking for somebody that had your style and they went to these film photographers first and they could say, "Hey, no, my friend Natalie is really going to be the best at this." So when it came to kind of transitioning over to Honeybook in San Francisco, like what were some of the fears that you had? And then talk about maybe, you're married and have 2 dogs that I just saw your website and I was like the new one and it's so good. I was like, I was just looking over, and this is like my competition going in, and it is in my Strengths Finder. I was like looking over, I was like, oh, I hate how good this site is, Natalie. But also too, like Jen Olmsted does like an amazing job
Yes.
for all the custom stuff. So anyway, sorry, I was like totally going on a tangent there. Tell me more about kind of the fears and maybe hesitations you had, and then maybe some of the ones that you and your family and considering that when making that transition, and then also how you guys are working that out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I first have to say, like, I have the best life partner in the entire world. My husband and I have been together for dating wise, together for 11 years, married for almost four. And we're definitely partners in crime. So from that perspective, when we realized he'd be able to keep his full-time job, just work remotely, and he was on board for it and for the adventure, it was a no-brainer for us. I mean, there really wasn't a struggle in terms of trying to make that decision. Ultimately, once I think we realized it would be fine for him and he wouldn't be sacrificing anything in the process, other than the teaching our dogs how to live in the city, which has actually been probably the most challenging part. Um, we did it. We leaped fearlessly. I think from the personal perspective, yes, it was a challenge, and there are obviously going to be moments where it's hard. We miss our family, we miss our friends. Um, but that wasn't so difficult so much as I think the internal struggle that I went through, from the perspective of, my own fears and what I was worried about. And actually, like I would say, I think this is probably applicable to a lot of us, and everything's in perspective. So, for instance, there are some days where my biggest fear is that I did this, by the way. So I hope y'all love this. My biggest fear is I'm going to send an email to 30,000 people and not include the correct link. Just did that at my launch, literally. Like the ConvertKit link did not work. Sorry, everyone who tried to click it. But that's a fear that's a small size. But then I also, on the other side, go, no, like moving across the country, stepping away from something that I know has supported my family, enabled me to pay off my student loans, enabled me to support other people even in the process through photography. I'm going to be setting that aside, and I'm going to be stepping into something that couldn't pan out. Like, I ultimately could come out here. I could have been miserable. I could have, I guess, all the worst case scenarios, all the worst case fears that you would have when you're letting something go. Also, like, who am I? Actually, this is probably the best one, but who am I if not a photographer? Like, everyone thinks of me as something. Who am I if I set that down? And if I'm being really honest, I worried about that for a long time. And then I got really good advice from a friend of mine who ultimately said to me, "You are so much more than a photographer. Like, you're a wife, you are, a writer, you are a dreamer, you are all these things." And it reminded me that we so often place our worth and we place our identity in one single thing, when in reality, all of us, every single one of us, has unique skill sets that extend far beyond the bio on our Instagrams. And what's really important is that in doing this, I also recognize there were a lot of photographers who have been running the rat race and looking up to me for years and thinking, I want to be just like her. And I had heard it. I had heard it for so long. And I wanted to give them permission to say, if at any point you decide you want to change your mind, if at any point you decide, look, I want to use the skills I've gained from this and I want to launch something new. I want to try something different. I want to break out of what everyone else is doing in this rat race. I'm giving you permission because I'm doing it too. I'm setting down my camera and I'm ultimately saying, I want to build something different, and that's okay. And I think so often we are afraid of making a change because we worry about failing. But I don't even think it's that so much as we worry about failing publicly. And as someone who, yes, has succeeded a lot publicly, I've also failed a lot publicly. We've launched things that have not worked. We've, had to, I mean, I won't even go down the list because it will probably take the entire rest of the podcast. But ultimately, I think once I realized that it's only failure if you don't learn something and stand back up, and I'm pretty good at learning something and standing back up. And I think you are pretty good at learning something and standing back up. The minute you realize that, everything else becomes a little bit less scary because you realize, worst case scenario, we move out here, it doesn't work, and we move home. And in that respect, I will never look back and wonder what if. I will always know in my heart that I chased a dream and I poured into people's lives and I did exactly what I was created to do with my skill set and with everything I've worked towards, to do it for others and to do it as to the best of my ability. And if it isn't enough, it's not enough, but I tried. And I think we should often have that that mindset. I think we often don't do anything if we feel like we can't win at it. We're so afraid to fail that it holds us back in this sort of, perfection paralysis that if we can't do it perfectly, we don't do it. And heck, I'm like, just start. Like just go for it. I don't know. I don't know if that answered the question, but I think fundamentally, I was afraid of a lot of things. I think I was most afraid of failing and what would people think. And then I quickly realized that if I let that hold me back, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had just given it a shot. Um, and I'm really, really, really glad that I did take that leap, and I don't regret it for a second.
Definitely. No, I think like we kind of talked about this with Abby Grace on the other episode. It's just like our and another episode as well, the imposter syndrome episode. Is just like your identity is like not like it doesn't matter if you're a photographer or not. Like your identity is outside of that. And then also when it comes back to the business side of things, like and luckily it's more open and it's easier to tell people now. It's like get clients that want to hire you for you, on the practical business side of like, your website right now, ironically, it's less photography focused, but it's so personable and, all about your quirks, and you have like a word of the day and you have your book stack, like what are you reading, which I think is the coolest thing ever. I'm just like, oh, I want this. And, but ultimately too, those like none of those are related to your photography. And, I think, something that like we always try and talk about and that we can come into our industry is like notorious for doing poorly is, and we're trying to get better at it, is like, kind of like Abby and I joked about, is like, just because somebody likes teal doesn't mean that we have to like teal. Like you can like something else, or like I love your new logo with the anchor. Like some people will be like, huh, what's the anchor? I'm like, oh, I bet it's Rising Tide. We're like, no, you're from Annapolis. Like,
Yep.
And so I love that. It's super cool. Tell me a little bit more about like, so now things are set up and things are looking good.
Mm-hmm.
As far as we know, what are you hoping for in your personal life for the next 5 years?
Oh,
And then also for Rising Tide, what does that look like in 5 years
yes. Oh,
with your full devotion? So
yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, what's funny is like, Rising Tide didn't even exist 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, I was graduating from college. So I think like I always hate saying what I think will happen, but I can say what I would love for, to happen. I think for on a personal level, I would love to continue to grow and learn. I am a huge nerd, as you mentioned. I absolutely love learning. I would love to continue to just read every book I can get my hands on, but I would also love to write a book. So I think, ultimately, dream scenario, writing a book personally, sharing sort of this journey that I've been on and the stories that I've heard over the course of traveling this country through Rising Tide. And then from a professional level, I think my dream would be that we build something that completely changes the way that creative entrepreneurs run their businesses and run their lives, so that they can get back more time with their families and that they can honestly acknowledge the fact that instead of competing with one another, we ultimately should compete with ourselves. We can compete with the version of who we are yesterday. And, that's such a cliche. I know everyone's heard that phrase, but it is so true. It's, I used to swim. I was a swimmer growing up as a kid. And actually, my husband and I met rowing. So it's a very, very similar mentality. And when you're swimming, you're trying to beat obviously the other people in the pool, but at the end of the day, what you're really racing against is your time yesterday. You're trying to outdo your time from the day before. And so I think of that sort of in the mentality of what do I want 5 years from now? I want someone who, is graduating from high school to recognize that being a creative, being an entrepreneur is a profession they should be proud of. I think that I want that person to step out from, high school, college, a divorce, even single parenthood, whatever stepping stone or season they are currently in, to step into one of entrepreneurship with a community that supports them, and ultimately have access to tools that I could have only dreamed of when I was getting started, both from an educational perspective and from a technological perspective, to decrease barriers to entry for, everyone when it comes to these tools. That's why I'm a big fan of free gatherings, free education up to a certain degree. Just to get you to a place where your business can start to prosper. And then ultimately too, I think that we've made incredible strides in empowering women in the industry. I think that I tell this story often. When I first started, I wanted to be a wedding photographer. And I had a mentor that said to me, like, women don't really shoot weddings. And I remember that like yesterday, like it was so vivid to me. And I'm the kind of person, if you tell me I can't do something, I'm gonna do it. I'm very, very motivated. We mentioned competition. I'm very motivated to overcome and very results driven. And so, I did. And fast forward now, where we joked just a little while ago, you were one of the only guys in the room. I almost feel like we have to work to be more inclusive towards men in a lot of these different pockets, and even within Rising Tide, really be intentional about just inclusivity in general, and ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to really thrive and be the best version of themselves. And we've got a lot of work to do as a country, a world, a community in that respect. But in 5 years, I would love to say that we have done the very best that we can to move everyone forward. Whether it's education, inclusivity, knowledge, access, things like that.
I love that. It makes me think. So one of my friends, he's founding, he is the founder right now of kind of like a Blue Apron, but it's modeled after, I don't know if I should give his idea away. Anyway, he has a really cool startup idea. And he has enough lawyers. It should be fine. Don't take his idea. And so he, but we've had conversations, and I used to work for Apple. And so I know kind of like a little bit about, not that Apple's a startup, but just kind of the California lifestyle, the steps in order to be successful, and, incubators and stuff like that. And the big talk with him was like, which incubator would his company choose, or which one would they get into? And it's so fascinating because I think about it now, Rising Tide, now, but also maybe even in 5 years, is kind of creating this, at least at the free level,
right?
Is hey, like, so you want to start a business? Here are these 5, videos, worksheets, invoice examples, and you guys already have a lot of this planned, but it just blows my mind now thinking about it. Like, hey, here it is. Like, here's, one of my big things with this podcast is like, don't make the mistakes that a lot of us make early on. And you can have a smoother and quicker rise to success, and we can kind of break the IRS, if you will, tradition of like, hey, most businesses fail in 5 years or 3 years, and like, how can we set up each other for success? And to me, like, a lot of people get like nervous about that, or like, oh, I don't want to share my contract or something like that. But it's like, hey, if we just had a Rising Tide standard, if you will, like, hey, here's your standard contract, and then whatever, like, we figure it out, like. I love that. So that's super cool. That's a great insight. And I think that's super useful too, to have these resources. So, 5 years from now, you have like, I was going to say Hope Taylor, but she probably wouldn't need it. You have that, like you said, that high school girl that is just like getting out of graduating, and she's like, I don't know what I want to do. And the parents are like, yeah, college.
Right.
Or, maybe they're not able to. And they find Rising Tide, and there's a local chapter, and so there's people and website. It's not just like some people find just a YouTube series and they're really cool, and like, so I love that. That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Go for it. Sorry. You go.
I was just saying, no, I even say like more than a website. I want I don't know if you know this, but I just don't love Facebook as a platform for professionals. And so my vision is even bigger than that. My vision is you wake up, and when you want to access your business, if you reach for your phone, there's a place where you can go where everything lives, and it's sort of a safe space for the professional, right? It's different. So I think that's not out of the picture for a world in 5 years from now, where perhaps there's a platform that's just ours, right? That's specific to the creative entrepreneur in the realm of what RTS has started to do, but also, like, you're right, like a starter kit, like basically like an incubator, in a sense, for people that want to basically quit their job, pursue their passion, and build a life that they could have only dreamed of. And I really honestly believe we have the amount of talent in this community to make that happen. There's so many brilliant people in Rising Tide that share so many amazing pieces of free education, free knowledge, access to resources. And so for us, it's about kind of gathering all of us together, figuring out how we can create something that's never been created before, and do it in a way that embraces technology. Hence why I'm out here in San Francisco.
Awesome. So next fun question is kind of like, how can somebody successfully, and this goes back to transitions, is, whether they're starting brand new or they want to change jobs. And I think the biggest email I get, other than people wondering about like how to price themselves, ironically, is, like, how do they make that transition? They have a spouse or something like that. Like, what are some, just even maybe even some tips of how somebody can successfully make the most of a transition. Maybe it's one that was forced upon them, or it's a spouse, or something that's best for the family, or they feel like they have to do it. What would some tips that you have like to share with them?
So I would say if I'm going to pick two things that I think are key to a successful transition, the first is preparation and the second is communication. So in terms of preparing for a transition, you ultimately want to think through all of the different logistics that will come out of that. So, for instance, for me, stepping aside from my wedding business and the revenue that's guaranteed through that, how am I going to put food on the table? Like, how am I going to make a living? Being prepared and that might mean like saving up an amount of your income if possible, if you have time. If not, just seeing areas that you can save money. We don't have cable. My husband and I, we've never had cable. We have found other ways around that, and we literally have like bunny antennas. I'm dead serious, and it's amazing. But also like Netflix, for instance. So figuring out what you need to do to prepare, whether it's financial or even just to have just a game plan, a plan A, a plan B. Okay, this is happening. We're doing it. And I think preparation also calms your nerves. When you think through worst case scenarios and you have options and different strategies to ensure that, everything is taken care of, you're more likely, you're set up for success. You're more likely to succeed, number one, but also you're less likely to be scared or nervous about it. Communication though, that honestly, like communication internally and externally. So like internally within your team, if you have a team or your family, your friends, and then externally as well. One of the things that I think I did well, and I'm really glad that I got this advice was, in a transition, take your audience along with you for the journey. Like bring them in, like actually share with them what you're going through, share with them, for me, it was literally sharing with them our trip across the country as we moved, but, communicate well and communicate often. And then also, side tip, little bonus tip is build a team to support you through that. And that doesn't mean a team that you hire, but maybe it is. But I think ultimately it's a team that can support you from an emotional and wisdom standpoint, to be there to listen when you're struggling, but also to give you really good advice every step of the way. And for me, I was so fortunate to have that. And again, it was majority rising tide leaders and members that I've met through the entire community that just really rallied in support and have been absolute beacons of light in this and just so encouraging. I mean, even launching my new website, I was so scared. Like you said, there's basically no photography on there. It's like very like anti-photo. I mean, there's like nothing. And that's so scary. I even said to Jen, I'm like, Jen, there are no photographs. And she's like, I know, but this is what we're doing. And this is aligns with the vision of the brand you want to create and how you want to impact people. And I was like, okay. So having that encouragement, having that support and that guidance and wisdom, and then the community to rally behind you it's honestly, guys, it's like the difference between honestly success and failure in a transition. Preparation, communication, and then I would add community. Just having that support from the people who know you best and who know your potential and your heart and what you have to offer. I think that there's tremendous value in that.
Awesome. Hey, well, thank you so much for being on here, and it was an absolute pleasure to finally have you on. And I remember the first time we actually like had a West Coast East Coast mess up scheduling wise, so that was really funny.
That was a big part of the transition. Again, the like time difference, it's such a struggle.
That is hilarious. So I want to ask you just three kind of quick. This is you're actually the first person to do this. So I want to start doing like a little tiny like lightning round, but it's honestly just to kind of build those quick resources for people and just help people get to know you a little bit better. So what book are you reading? What album are you listening to? And what's one goal, which we kind of talked about, that you have for 2017? So tell me a little bit more about that.
Love it. Okay, book I'm reading. I'm currently reading .com Secrets. It was recommended to me last weekend, and so I Amazon Primed it, and it got delivered yesterday. So I'm reading that, which I so far really love. It's a pretty cool book. Again, very different from something I would normally read, but I'm loving it. What was the other one? Album. So
Yep.
I'm not really like an album person. I'm more of like a Spotify playlist girl. However, I'm really into the acoustic covers playlist on Spotify. If you go and check it out, it's great. But if you want work music, I listen to what is it called? Brain Food.
Yeah.
Food every single day. It is like like I literally get into a trance of work and productivity. It's amazing. What was the last one, Adam?
What's one goal you have for 2017? Or maybe you can talk
Ah,
a little bit more. What are some ways that you said your word of the year is present? So what's one
yes.
practical thing by the end of the year that you will have will have done in the name of being present?
So again, I would say like my overarching goal is be present. When you break it down into actual like individual I'm like I'm about to get like the metrics that define whether I've been
Do it.
successful or not.
Do
No,
it.
but in all honesty, I love when people talk numbers. It's so exciting. But in all honesty, I think just to keep it high level, I one of my goals was to eliminate at least one form of social media from my life, and I did that. I deleted Snapchat this week, so yes. Um, in
I read
addition
the blog post. I was so sad about it.
Oh my gosh. No, but here's the funny part. The funny part are the number of people that have reached out to me through Instagram stories to be like, I love that you just did that. I've been wanting to do this. Again, like people need, it sounds so silly, but it's like people often feel like they need permission. They don't. But when they see someone else go for something, they're like, I've not used Snapchat in a month. And I was like, yeah, you know what? I haven't either. And I'm eliminating it so that it's not something to stress about. I'm only going to use Instagram stories. I'm going to communicate with my audience where to go. And it's actually been a greater ROI as you read in the blog post, which has been really interesting. But yeah, eliminating social media platforms from my life, simplifying any way that I can. This sounds silly, but like I now signed up for Le Tote, which is like clothing rentals. So I don't even go shopping. Like I rent my clothes, they mail me new clothes every week. And it sounds really silly, but it just saves me time so I can spend, again, it's like spending more time being present, not stressing about what to wear. I use HelloFresh. I can't wait to hear what your friend's building in terms of like food delivery because it's changed my life. So even outsourcing that, like meal prep done. Just finding ways to get as much time back so that I can spend time just with my husband and my dogs.
That's awesome. I love that. Thank you so much for coming on. What would be your favorite place for people to find you and find out more about what you guys are doing? And I'll link up Rising Tide Society in the show notes, of course.
Awesome. Yeah. So I would say for RTS, go straight to risingtidesociety.com. You can also find it obviously on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, both group and page. For me personally, just nataliefranke.com. I have a really awesome little library over there of freebies for you guys. So, like my wedding questionnaire, you can download and start using today. In addition to that, I've put all 7 years of wedding photography experience into an actual book, which took me a lot of time, but I'm super proud of it. So, that's over there too. But yeah, feel free to reach out. Just Natalie at risingtidesociety.com, or you can email me, Natalie at nataliefranke.com. I'm just here to support you guys and share any knowledge I can. Like you said, Adam, there really aren't secrets when it comes to this stuff. We all are in it together. And I think it's so important for you guys to just have access. If you need anything at all, just send me an email.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Natalie.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah. I love Natalie Franke. She always gets me super pumped up. I was checking out her new website before she came on the podcast, and it is so good. It was so good. Anyway, guys, if you loved what you heard from Natalie, definitely check out her links in the show notes. Join a Rising Tide Society chapter wherever you are. Pretty much, if you're in the U.S., there is one for you. If there's not one, you should start one. Do it. Thanks so much for listening to the Bearded Tog Podcast, guys. If you have any questions, concerns, or ideas, or you're a sponsor, shoot me an email at thebeardedtog@gmail.com, and I would love to chat. We've got some exciting episodes coming up, so thanks so much.